My nephew's behavioral problems at school were his only way of telling us his stepfather was hurting him at home. The principal called it escalating aggression when she handed me the incident report. 3 fights in 2 weeks, a broken window, a teacher's aide with scratches on her forearm. My nephew Caleb was 8 years old and weighed 52 pounds, and they were talking about him like he was a threat to public safety. I sat in that fluorescent-lit office staring at the words immediate suspension pending evaluation, while my sister sobbed into her hands and her husband rubbed her back with practiced concern. I remember thinking how strange it was that Caleb had been such a gentle kid just 6 months ago. The kind of boy who cried when he accidentally stepped on a caterpillar. The kind of boy who drew pictures of rainbows and gave them to strangers at the grocery store. Now they were describing him as volatile, dangerous, disturbed. I looked at my brother-in-law's face while the principal spoke, and something cold moved through my chest. His expression was perfect. Worried father, supportive spouse, baffled by his stepson's sudden transformation. Too perfect. The kind of performance you only recognize when you've spent years learning to read people who lie for a living. I'm a forensic interviewer. I've spent 11 years working with children who've experienced trauma, abuse, and things no child should ever have to name. I've sat in small rooms with tiny chairs and asked questions designed to unlock truths that adults have tried to bury. I've listened to children describe horrors in the same tone they'd used to talk about a cartoon they watched that morning. Dissociation, compartmentalization, survival. I know what trauma looks like when it wears a child's face, and I knew what I was seeing in my nephew even before I had proof. But knowing and proving are different countries separated by oceans of bureaucracy, family loyalty, and the desperate human need to believe that monsters don't live in our own homes. My sister Danielle had married Graham Whitfield 18 months earlier after a whirlwind courtship that made everyone uncomfortable except her. She'd been a single mother for 5 years after Caleb's biological father died in a construction accident, and Graham had seemed like an answer to prayers she'd stopped praying. Successful insurance adjuster, no criminal record, active in his church, coached youth basketball at the community center. He drove a spotless Subaru Outback and remembered everyone's birthday. He called my mother Mom after knowing her for 3 months. Looking back, the red flags were everywhere, but hindsight is a cruel teacher. The first sign I noticed was at Thanksgiving dinner, about 4 months after the wedding. Caleb had always been a chatty kid, the type who'd tell you about every Pokemon evolution in excruciating detail whether you asked or not. That Thanksgiving, he barely spoke. When Graham asked him to pass the rolls, Caleb's hand trembled so violently that he knocked over his water glass. I watched Graham's jaw tighten for just a fraction of a second before he laughed it off and helped clean up the mess. Later, when I asked Caleb if he wanted to play video games in the den like we always did, he looked at Graham before answering. Not at his mother. At Graham. Graham gave an almost imperceptible nod, and only then did Caleb say yes. I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself that blended families were hard and that Caleb was probably just adjusting to having a new authority figure in his life. I told myself that my job had made me paranoid, that I saw abuse everywhere because I dealt with it every day. I believed my own rationalizations for exactly 3 more months, until Caleb started getting in trouble at school and I couldn't look away anymore. The fight started in January. Caleb shoved a classmate during recess and wouldn't explain why. Then he threw a book at his teacher's head and spent 2 days in-school suspension. Then he bit another student hard enough to leave a mark that required a doctor's visit. Each incident seemed to come out of nowhere. Caleb's teacher, a 20-year veteran named Mrs. Evelyn Prescott, sent home notes expressing concern about his sudden personality change and recommending psychological evaluation. Danielle and Graham took him to a child psychiatrist who diagnosed ADHD and oppositional defiant disorder after a single 45-minute session. They put him on medication that made him zombie-like and distant. I visited one Sunday afternoon and found him sitting on the living room couch staring at nothing, his eyes flat and empty. When I said his name, it took him almost 5 seconds to turn his head toward me. Graham explained that the medication was still being adjusted and that the doctor said it would take time. I asked to see the bathroom and instead went to Caleb's room. The door was open just a crack, and I pushed it wider without thinking. What I saw made my stomach drop through the floor. There was a lock on the outside of his bedroom door, a heavy-duty deadbolt, the kind you'd use on a front door, installed backwards so it could only be locked from the hallway. I took a picture with my phone before I even processed what I was doing. 11 years of training kicking in, overriding the part of my brain that was screaming at me to confront Graham immediately. Document first, react later. I went to the bathroom, splashed water on my face, and stared at my reflection until my hands stopped shaking. When I came back downstairs, I made small talk about work and weather and the upcoming spring, and I watched Graham's face while Danielle chattered about her book club. He was watching me too. Just for a moment, when Danielle went to the kitchen to get more coffee, his mask slipped. He looked at me with an expression I can only describe as calculating, like he was trying to determine whether I was a threat. I smiled blandly and asked about his fantasy basketball league, and the mask slid back into place. I left an hour later with my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. In my car, I called my supervisor, Dr. Randall Okonkwo, a child psychologist with 30 years of experience in trauma and abuse cases. I told him about the lock, about Caleb's behavior changes, about the way he looked at Graham before answering questions. Dr. Okonkwo listened without interrupting, which was one of his greatest skills. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said the words I already knew but needed to hear from someone else. You need to report this. Tonight. Before he knows you've seen anything. I called Child Protective Services at 8:47 that evening. The intake worker was a woman named Priscilla Dunmore, who sounded exhausted in the way that only people who work in child welfare ever sound. I gave her everything I had, which wasn't much. A photograph of a lock, behavioral changes at school, a gut feeling honed by over a decade of professional experience. She typed while I talked, asked clarifying questions, and finally told me that a caseworker would be assigned within 72 hours. 72 hours. I wanted to scream that 72 hours was an eternity when a child was in danger, but I knew how the system worked. I knew that CPS was understaffed and overwhelmed and that a case involving a well-off white family with no prior reports would be categorized as low priority. I thanked her and hung up and sat in my dark car outside my apartment for 20 minutes, trying to figure out what to do next. The answer came from an unexpected source. At 9:23, my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. The message was 3 words. He hurts me. Then another. Don't tell Mom. Then a third. She won't believe. I stared at the screen while my vision blurred with tears I refused to let fall. Caleb had somehow gotten access to a phone, probably an old device lying around the house, and reached out to me because he had no one else. I texted back carefully, knowing that anything I wrote could potentially be used as evidence later. I typed, I believe you. I'm going to help you. Can you tell me more when it's safe? The response took 4 agonizing minutes. He comes at night, after Mom sleeps, says it's discipline, says I deserve it because I'm bad. Another message. Don't want to be bad anymore. Then, scared. I wanted to drive to their house immediately and tear Caleb out of that home with my bare hands. Instead, I forced myself to think like a professional rather than an aunt. I needed more information, more evidence, something that would make the authorities act faster than their usual glacial pace. I asked Caleb if Graham had ever hurt him in ways that left marks. The response made me grip my steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white. Belt sometimes, hands mostly, pinches where clothes cover, shows me pictures on his phone to scare me, says if I tell they'll take me away and I'll never see Mom again. I screenshot every message. Then I called Dr. Okonkwo again and told him what Caleb had disclosed. His voice was grave when he responded. This changes the timeline. Tomorrow morning you need to go to the school and request to speak with Caleb. As a family member with professional credentials, you can request a welfare check interview. Document everything he tells you. If he discloses abuse directly to you in a professional capacity, that gives us grounds for immediate intervention. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, running through every possible scenario, every way this could go wrong. The next morning, I was waiting in the school parking lot when Mrs. Prescott arrived at 7:15. I'd called ahead and explained the situation in vague terms, enough to get her cooperation without compromising any potential investigation. She was a sturdy woman in her late 50s with kind eyes and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd weathered decades of difficult students and difficult parents. She listened to my request and nodded slowly. I've been worried about that boy, she said quietly. Something's been off all year, but his mother and stepfather always have explanations. Medical issues, adjustment problems, medication side effects. They're very convincing. She paused, choosing her words carefully. But last week, Caleb drew something during free art time that I haven't been able to stop thinking about. He drew a house with a big smiling sun and a rainbow, typical kid stuff. But in one of the windows there was a dark figure. When I asked him about it, he scribbled over the whole thing until you couldn't see anything anymore. Then he tore the paper into pieces and threw it away. She looked at me with an expression that told me she already knew what I suspected. I saved the pieces, taped them back together after he went to lunch. I wasn't sure what to do with it, but I knew it meant something. She handed me a manila folder. Inside was the reconstructed drawing, and my heart seized when I saw it clearly. The dark figure in the window wasn't just a shape. Caleb had drawn it with careful detail despite his young age. A man with angry eyes and hands shaped like claws, reaching toward a tiny stick figure in a bed. I met with Caleb in the school counselor's office at 9:30 that morning. The counselor, Dr. Amanda Reeves, a licensed clinical social worker with 15 years of experience, had been briefed and agreed to observe while I conducted the interview. I'd explained that my credentials and relationship to Caleb made me uniquely positioned to earn his trust quickly, and she'd understood the urgency. Caleb walked into the room looking smaller than ever, his school uniform slightly too big, his eyes darting to every corner before settling on my face. When he saw me, something shifted in his expression. Not quite relief, but something close. The desperate hope of someone who's been drowning and finally sees a hand reaching down. I kept my voice calm and warm, the way I'd been trained to speak to traumatized children. Hey, buddy, I thought we could talk for a little bit. Is that okay? He nodded slowly, still not speaking. I noticed he was holding his left arm against his body in a protective way, and my stomach clenched. I asked him to sit down, and he did, choosing the chair farthest from the door. Smart kid. He'd already learned to keep escape routes in sight. I started with easy questions about school, friends, favorite subjects, building rapport, establishing safety. Caleb's answers were monosyllabic at first, but gradually he began to relax, his shoulders dropping from their defensive hunch. After about 10 minutes, I gently shifted the conversation toward home. I asked Caleb to tell me about his family, and he talked about his mom first. How she made the best grilled cheese sandwiches. How she read him stories before bed. At least she used to before Graham said he was too old for that. How she worked long hours at the hospital as a nurse and was always tired when she came home. His voice got quieter when he mentioned Graham. I asked what Graham was like, keeping my tone neutral and curious rather than leading. Caleb was silent for a long moment, picking at a thread on his sleeve. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "He's nice when Mom's watching." I felt Dr. Reeves shift slightly behind me, but I didn't break eye contact with Caleb. "And when Mom's not watching?" Another long pause. Caleb's eyes filled with tears, but he didn't let them fall. At 8 years old, he'd already learned to control his crying, and that knowledge broke something inside me. He says I'm bad, that I need to learn, that my real dad would be ashamed of me. His voice cracked. My dad wasn't ashamed of me. My dad loved me. Graham's a liar. The words came faster now, tumbling out like water through a cracked dam. He locks me in my room when Mom's at work, sometimes for hours. He takes away my food if I talk back. He hits me but only where clothes cover so no one sees. He shows me videos of bad things happening to kids and says that's what happens to boys who tell. Caleb was shaking now, his small body vibrating with the effort of finally speaking the truth he'd been forced to swallow for months. I asked Caleb if I could see where Graham had hurt him, explaining that it was important for helping him stay safe. He hesitated, then slowly lifted his shirt. Dr. Reeves made a small sound behind me, and I understood why. Caleb's torso was a map of abuse. Old bruises in various stages of healing, yellowing and green and fresh purple. Pinch marks along his sides, the distinctive pattern of adult fingers gripping child skin. A fading mark on his lower back that looked like it had been made by a belt buckle. I took photographs with clinical detachment while my heart screamed. 12 pictures in total, each one evidence of systematic torture disguised as discipline. When I finished, I told Caleb he was incredibly brave and that none of this was his fault. I told him that Graham had been lying and that telling the truth was the right thing to do, even when it was scary. I told him I was going to make sure he was safe. He looked at me with eyes too old for his face and asked the question that haunted me for months afterward. Will Mom hate me? I knelt down to his level and took his hands in mine, feeling how cold they were, how small. Your mom loves you more than anything in the world. She might be confused at first because Graham has been lying to her too, but when she knows the truth, she's going to be so proud of you for being brave enough to tell it. I wasn't sure if I believed my own words. Danielle had always been the type to see the best in people, sometimes to the point of blindness. She'd defended our father's emotional cruelty for years, reframing his neglect as tough love, and his cutting remarks as honesty. She'd married Caleb's biological father despite everyone warning her that construction workers with substance abuse issues made unreliable partners, and she'd been devastated when he'd proven them right by getting himself killed driving drunk to a job site. Then she'd married Graham after knowing him for barely 6 months, ignoring every red flag because she was desperate for stability, for partnership, for someone to help carry the weight of single parenthood. I loved my sister, but I knew her weaknesses. She wanted to believe in Graham because the alternative was admitting she'd brought a monster into her son's life, and that kind of guilt could destroy a person. After Caleb went back to class, I sat with Dr. Reeves and reviewed the documentation. She was pale and tight-lipped, the professional mask she wore cracking at the edges. I've seen a lot in this job, she said quietly. But the calculated nature of this, hiding the marks, using psychological torture, isolating him from support systems, this is predatory. This is a pattern of behavior from someone who's done this before. She looked at me directly. You need to call the police. Today. Right now. CPS can take weeks to act, and that child cannot go back to that house tonight. I called the police from the school parking lot at 11:15 a.m. The dispatcher transferred me to the Special Victims Unit, where I spoke with Detective Raymond Cortez, a 22-year veteran who specialized in child abuse cases. His voice was calm and professional as I explained the situation, but I could hear the tension underlying his questions. I told him about the disclosure, the photographs, the lock on the bedroom door, the months of escalating behavioral problems that now made terrible sense. Detective Cortez asked me to meet him at the station to provide a formal statement and share the documentation. I was there within 30 minutes, sitting in an interview room that felt eerily familiar from the other side. I handed over everything, the photographs of Caleb's injuries, the screenshot of his text messages, Mrs. Prescott's reconstructed drawing, my written notes from the interview. Detective Cortez reviewed each piece of evidence with the methodical focus of someone building a case. When he finished, he looked at me with an expression that was equal parts admiration and sympathy. You did everything right, he said. A lot of family members in your position would have confronted the abuser directly, which would have given him time to prepare a defense and potentially escalate the abuse. Instead, you documented, you reported, and you got the child's disclosure on record. That's going to make this case a lot stronger. He paused. But I need to be honest with you about what happens next. We're going to arrest Graham Whitfield today, but your sister is going to be questioned too. If she knew about the abuse and did nothing, she could face charges. The thought of Danielle being arrested made my stomach turn, but I forced myself to stay focused. I don't think she knew, I said carefully. Graham is manipulative. He isolated Caleb, controlled the narrative, made sure the abuse happened when Danielle wasn't around. She's a victim too, even if she's not the primary victim. Detective Cortez nodded slowly. That's going to be for investigators and prosecutors to determine. For now, we need to move quickly. Graham Whitfield works from home on Thursdays, right? I confirmed that he did. Danielle would be at the hospital until 7, which gave police a window to make the arrest without her present. It wasn't ideal, but it reduced the risk of Graham using her as a shield or manipulating her before he could be taken into custody. I spent the next 3 hours at the station, providing additional statements and answering questions. Detective Cortez brought in a forensic interviewer from the county's Child Advocacy Center to discuss next steps for Caleb. Her name was Dr. Imani Okafor, and she had a gentle authority that immediately put me at ease. She explained that Caleb would need to undergo a full forensic interview and medical examination at the CAC, both to document the extent of the abuse and to ensure he hadn't experienced sexual abuse in addition to the physical and emotional torture. The possibility of sexual abuse hadn't occurred to me consciously, but somewhere in the back of my mind, it had been lurking like a shadow. The pictures on his phone that Caleb had mentioned, the lock on the bedroom door, the calculated predatory nature of Graham's behavior. The arrest happened at 2:34 p.m. I wasn't there, but Detective Cortez called me afterward to report that Graham had been taken into custody without incident. He'd answered the door expecting a package delivery and found 4 officers with a warrant instead. According to Cortez, Graham's mask hadn't slipped even then. He'd remained calm, cooperative, almost amused, as if the whole thing was a misunderstanding that would be cleared up quickly. Guys like him always think they're smarter than everyone else, Cortez said grimly. They spend so much time manipulating people that they believe they can manipulate their way out of anything. He's going to find out different. The harder conversation came 3 hours later, when Danielle got off her shift and discovered that her husband had been arrested and her son had been taken into emergency protective custody. I was waiting at her house when she pulled into the driveway, having spent the intervening hours preparing myself for what I knew would be the most difficult conversation of my life. She saw me standing on her porch and immediately knew something was catastrophically wrong. Her face went white and she was out of her car and running toward me before the engine had fully stopped. "Where's Caleb?" she screamed. "What happened? Where's my son?" I caught her by the shoulders and forced her to look at me. "Caleb is safe. He's at the Child Advocacy Center with a social worker. He's not hurt. But Danielle, I need you to listen to me. Graham has been arrested." The next hour was one of the worst of my life. I told Danielle everything. The months of abuse, the lock on the door, the calculated torture hidden beneath a veneer of disciplinary parenting. I showed her the photographs of Caleb's injuries, watching her face crumble as each image destroyed another piece of the reality she'd constructed. She kept saying no over and over, as if repetition could make the truth untrue. Then the denial shifted to bargaining. Maybe Caleb had misunderstood. Maybe the bruises were from the fights at school. Maybe Graham had been strict but not abusive, and everything had been blown out of proportion. I let her cycle through the stages of grief, knowing from experience that pushing too hard would only strengthen her resistance. When she finally collapsed onto her couch, sobbing so hard she could barely breathe, I sat beside her and held her the way I'd held her when we were children, and our father had said something cruel. I told her that this wasn't her fault, that Graham had manipulated her just as he'd manipulated Caleb, that predators were skilled at hiding their true nature from everyone around them. I told her that the only thing that mattered now was being there for her son. Slowly, agonizingly, Danielle began to accept the truth. By the end of the night, she was asking what she needed to do to get Caleb back and how she could help the prosecution put Graham away forever. The sister I knew, the fierce mother underneath all the denial, was starting to surface. The investigation that followed revealed horrors I hadn't anticipated. When police executed a search warrant on the house, they found Graham's laptop hidden in a locked filing cabinet in the garage. The laptop contained over 300 images and videos of child sexual abuse material, along with a folder of photographs he'd taken of Caleb in states of undress. There were also chat logs showing conversations with other predators, exchanging tips on how to groom children and avoid detection. Graham Whitfield wasn't just an abuser. He was part of a network, connected to people across the country who traded in children's suffering like currency. The FBI got involved. What had started as a local child abuse case became part of a federal investigation that would eventually result in 14 arrests across 6 states. Graham's laptop led investigators to a man in Oregon who was actively abusing his foster children, a youth pastor in Texas who'd been molesting members of his congregation for years, and a teacher in Florida who'd been collecting images of his students through hidden cameras. Each arrest led to more victims, more evidence, more monsters exposed to the light. Meanwhile, Caleb began the long process of healing. The forensic interview at the Child Advocacy Center confirmed that the abuse had been primarily physical and psychological. Graham hadn't sexually touched Caleb directly, though the photographs and exposure to explicit material constituted sexual abuse under the law. Dr. Okafor told me that Caleb's behavioral problems at school had been his unconscious way of asking for help, a desperate signal flare when words felt too dangerous to use. He'd been fighting and acting out because he couldn't fight back at home, couldn't speak the truth, couldn't do anything except explode in environments where the stakes felt lower. The trial began 8 months later. Graham Whitfield faced 73 federal charges related to the possession and distribution of child sexual abuse material, along with state charges for child abuse, assault, and unlawful imprisonment. His defense attorney, a slick criminal lawyer named Philip Hargrove, tried to argue that the laptop had been planted, that Caleb had been coached to lie, that the prosecution's case was built on the testimony of a vindictive sister-in-law with a professional bias toward finding abuse. The arguments were desperate and transparent, the flailing of a defense with nothing substantive to offer. I testified on the 4th day of the trial. The prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Natalie Kim, walked me through my credentials, my relationship to Caleb, and the sequence of events that led to Graham's arrest. I described noticing the lock on Caleb's bedroom door, receiving his text messages, conducting the interview at school, documenting his injuries. I kept my voice steady even when the defense attorney tried to rattle me during cross-examination, suggesting that my professional background had made me see abuse where none existed, that I'd manipulated a troubled child into false accusations. Mr. Hargrove, I replied calmly, I've conducted over 2,000 forensic interviews in my career. I know the difference between a coached disclosure and a genuine one. Caleb's language, his body language, his physiological responses, every single indicator pointed to a child describing real experiences. The photographs of his injuries weren't coached. The lock on his bedroom door wasn't coached. The 300 images on your client's laptop weren't coached. Hargrove had no response to that. Caleb testified via closed-circuit video from a separate room, an accommodation granted to spare him the trauma of facing his abuser directly. I watched on the courtroom monitor as he described the nights when Graham would come to his room after his mother fell asleep, the punishments for imagined infractions, the terror of being shown images of violence against children with whispered warnings about what happened to boys who told. His voice shook sometimes, but he didn't cry. Afterward, Dr. Okafor told me that children who've been through trauma often develop a kind of emotional numbness that allows them to recount horrific experiences without visible distress. It's a survival mechanism, she said, the same dissociation that helped them endure the abuse in the first place. Danielle testified too. She took the stand and admitted that she'd missed every warning sign, that she'd been so desperate for Graham to be the answer to her prayers that she'd ignored the evidence right in front of her face. She described the ways Graham had isolated Caleb from her, always volunteering to handle bedtime and discipline so she could rest after her long shifts, praising his strictness as good parenting while hiding the reality of what strict meant. She wept on the stand, and for once I didn't see weakness in her tears. I saw a mother who'd been deceived and was now willing to expose her own failures to protect her son. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours, guilty on all counts. When the verdict was read, Graham Whitfield finally lost his composure. His face contorted with rage, and he turned to glare at me with an expression of pure hatred. I held his gaze without flinching. I wanted him to see that his attempts to destroy my nephew had failed, that the little boy he'd tortured had people who loved him enough to fight for the truth. The sentencing hearing was 3 months later. Victims and their families were given the opportunity to deliver impact statements, and I watched as parent after parent took the stand to describe how Graham's network of predators had devastated their children's lives. A mother from Oregon talked about finding her foster son curled in a ball, unable to stop shaking after disclosing years of abuse. A father from Texas described his daughter's suicide attempt when the truth about her youth pastor became public. The weight of suffering in that courtroom was almost unbearable, and all of it traced back to the digital threads connecting these monsters to each other. When it was my turn, I didn't talk about statistics or professional expertise. I talked about my nephew. Caleb is 9 years old now, I said, looking directly at Graham. He still has nightmares. He still flinches when adult men raise their voices. He's in therapy twice a week, learning to trust again, learning that his body is his own, learning that the world contains good people as well as bad ones. He draws pictures now of superheroes who protect kids from monsters. He told me last week that he wants to be a police officer when he grows up, so he can help other kids who are scared like he was. You tried to break him. You failed. He is brave and resilient and loved, and he is going to have a beautiful life that you will never touch again. Graham was sentenced to 45 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. Given his age, it was effectively a life sentence. He'd die in a cell, surrounded by other predators, stripped of the freedom and authority he'd used to terrorize a child. It wasn't enough. Nothing would ever be enough to undo what he'd done. But it was justice, and justice mattered. The aftermath stretched long beyond the courtroom. Caleb came to live with me for 6 months while Danielle sold the house that had become a crime scene and found a new apartment in a different neighborhood. She quit her job at the hospital and took a position with shorter hours, determined to be present for her son in ways she hadn't been before. Our relationship was strained at first, the weight of what had happened creating a distance between us that felt impossible to bridge. She struggled with guilt and shame, with the knowledge that she'd brought an abuser into her child's life and failed to see the truth until someone else revealed it. I struggled with anger. with the irrational feeling that she should have known, should have protected Caleb, should have seen what I eventually saw. We both went to therapy, separately and together, learning to forgive ourselves and each other. It took time. It took work. It took countless difficult conversations where we said things that hurt and then found ways to move past the hurt toward healing. 3 years later, we're closer than we've ever been, bound together by survival, rather than separated by trauma. Caleb is 12 now. He's in 7th grade, plays soccer, and has a small group of close friends who know nothing about his past. His behavioral problems disappeared once the source of his trauma was removed, replaced by the normal challenges of adolescence. He still goes to therapy, still has hard days, still sometimes wakes up from nightmares. But he's also funny and kind and fiercely protective of smaller kids who are being bullied. He remembers what it felt like to be helpless, and he's channeled that memory into empathy rather than bitterness. Last month, Caleb asked me why I believed him when no one else did. We were sitting on my porch watching the sunset, and the question came out of nowhere the way important questions often do with kids. I thought carefully before answering. I believed you because I know how to listen, I said. But Caleb, you were the brave one. You found a way to tell me even when you'd been taught that telling was dangerous. You reached out when you were scared. That takes more courage than most adults have. He was quiet for a moment, then said, I was scared you wouldn't believe me either. Graham said no one would. I put my arm around him and pulled him close. There will always be people who don't believe, I admitted. There will always be people who find it easier to look away, but there will also always be people who see the truth and fight for it. You just have to find them. And Caleb, you found me. You saved yourself by reaching out. Never forget that. He leaned his head against my shoulder, and we watched the sky turn orange and pink and finally purple. The world is full of monsters. I've spent my career learning to recognize them, to expose them, to help their victims rebuild lives from the rubble of what they've destroyed. But the world is also full of survivors, full of people who refuse to stay silent, who find ways to speak even when they've been told their voices don't matter. Caleb is one of those people. At 8 years old, he found a way to ask for help using the only language he had available. His behavioral problems weren't problems at all. They were a message, written in the only code he could safely use. All it took was someone willing to read it. No, if you made it this far, thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.